Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when life was, shall we say, a little more direct. When people didn't have complicated social media feuds or passive-aggressive emails or accidentally sending reply all to the entire kingdom. No, back then, disagreements often ended with a sword, an axe, or a quiet little pit in the ground. And someone had to do that job. Somebody had to make sure justice was delivered efficiently and with minimal fuss. And that somebody was usually called the executioner, which, as you might imagine, was not the most popular profession. It came with job security, certainly, and a pension, well, sometimes. But mostly, it came with stares, whispers, and a deep, abiding social suspicion. Because of course it did. Now, you might picture executioners as fearsome, hulking figures in black hoods, scaring everyone into obedience. And yes, that is a common image, largely fueled by 19th century paintings and sensationalized chronicles. But in reality, many executioners were ordinary men. Some were small, some portly, some had a penchant for baking. Some were even fairly gentle, which, naturally, was an awkward trait for someone tasked with chopping heads off on a Thursday afternoon. So what happened when these people eventually retired? Because eventually, everyone has to hang up the axe or set aside the noose. And yet, retirement was complicated. Firstly, there was the question of community acceptance. Villagers, nobles, and local merchants all knew who you were. You weren't just anyone. You were the person who had made someone's mother or husband or tax collector leave this world rather abruptly. And unfortunately, people tend to remember these things, even decades later. Some retired executioners tried to settle into quieter lives. A few opened taverns, baking shops, or inns, but patrons often eyed them nervously while passing their coins across the counter, probably wondering if they, too, were next. There are accounts of retired executioners being offered money for protection, though one suspects this was mostly a polite way to avoid walking past them on the street. Others attempted to marry. And here we see the first serious complication. Being an executioner wasn't just a job, it was a social stain. Families, understandably, hesitated to let their daughters marry someone who spent most of his days ending lives. And in smaller towns, this stigma could be total. Entire villages might quietly conspire to prevent the executioner from courting or settling down simply out of a sense of general unease. One curious pattern emerges in the historical records. Many retired executioners, when they couldn't marry, lived with extended family or in communal housing with other executioners. It was a small, tightly knit subculture. Imagine a sort of medieval guild, but for people who were extremely good at decapitation. They shared recipes, war stories, and techniques for handling awkwardly resistant prisoners. And, of course, a steady supply of dark humor.
And there was the question of property. Executioners often earned decent money during their careers, though not always enough to retire luxuriously. Some invested in land, thinking this would make them respectable. Unfortunately, landlords and neighbors often discovered their profession, resulting in subtle, passive-aggressive harassment. Cows wandering off, fences mysteriously collapsing, doors left unlocked, the small village equivalent of, "We don't hate you, we just strongly disapprove." Some historians note that certain executioners leveraged their notoriety into political influence. Strange as it may seem, kings and dukes sometimes respected a retired executioner more than they did other tradesmen. The logic is not entirely clear, but perhaps it was a mix of intimidation and recognition of practical skill. If you could carefully, politely, and efficiently remove someone's head, you probably had a certain persuasive talent in council chambers. Naturally, not all executioners retired well. Some ended up isolated, living out their days alone, their only visitors being curious children or historians a few centuries later. One particularly melancholy account describes an executioner in 15th century Germany who spent his retirement tending a small garden, quietly naming the vegetables after former clients. Carrot for the cobbler, onion for the mayor, you get the idea. He reportedly died peacefully, though perhaps a little haunted by the literal ghosts of his work. There's a subtle irony in all of this, of course. The very people tasked with enforcing justice and order often found themselves judged endlessly in return. While kings and dukes were forgiven for constant cruelty, an executioner's job hung over him like a mild, persistent cloud. And while the executioner's work was critical, their lives after the fact were often fraught with quiet misfortune. It's also interesting to note that in some regions, executioners had unusual perks. In France, for instance, the official executioner sometimes inherited privileges from previous executioners: tax exemptions, access to markets, the right to brew beer. But even with these benefits, social acceptance was never guaranteed. People tolerated them, certainly, but they rarely loved them. Another curiosity involves children of executioners. One might imagine that growing up as the offspring of someone whose profession revolves around mortality would be deeply traumatic. And yes, sometimes it was. But in some families, the children learned practical skills, clever trades, and oddly enough, an unusual sort of civic responsibility. They knew, better than most, that life was fleeting, and that societal structures often relied on unpleasant but necessary work. And speaking of family, it's worth mentioning that executioners often married into other executioner families. It became almost a hereditary line, much like the passing down of surnames or estates. This was convenient because it allowed them to maintain social bonds in a world that largely looked askance at them. It was also, for some, a tacit acknowledgement that outsiders rarely wanted to marry someone associated with regular decapitations. So in some ways, retirement for an executioner was less about money or comfort and more about navigating a subtle social labyrinth. They had to find ways to live with people who simultaneously depended on their past work and feared it. They had to cultivate skills beyond the axe: diplomacy, humor, patience, and a gentle way of explaining why they might still have a small collection of heads in the back room, purely for historical curiosity.
And yet, despite all this, executioners persisted. They carved out niches, settled into villages, and found quiet ways to contribute. Some became respected citizens in the end. Some faded into obscurity. And some, understandably, spent their retirement quietly muttering about the absurdities of justice, humanity, and the occasional clumsy king. Let's drift over to the next interesting quirk about these retired figures: their occasional brushes with superstition. Because humans, being humans, have never been comfortable with death. And when someone had been professionally acquainted with it, people assumed they must be either cursed or magically powerful. In certain regions, villagers would seek out retired executioners for minor hex removal or fortune-telling, reasoning that if you could handle a sword and a noose, surely you could handle a hex. Naturally, this put the executioner in a rather awkward position. Imagine a man who spent decades gently, politely, and efficiently removing people from life's stage, now quietly being asked to divine the future or lift curses. And perhaps the strangest aspect is that some executioners actually leaned into this. Not because they were particularly mystical, but because if people feared your spiritual powers, they tended to leave you alone. It was an effective method of maintaining personal safety, which, after decades of chopping, one might imagine becomes rather appealing.
By the time an executioner reached old age, a delicate balance had formed. They had money, perhaps a small home, a network of others like them, and the occasional curious or superstitious visitor. They had survived the worst of social ostracism, occasional mob anger, and the general unease of being associated with death. And, if they were lucky, they could pass quietly into a retirement that was, if not peaceful, at least tolerable. So, the life of a retired executioner was neither glamorous nor heroic in the traditional sense. It was quietly absurd, socially complicated, and occasionally lonely. But for those who survived it, there was a certain rhythm to the absurdity. A small comfort in knowing that in a world of unpredictable rulers, chaotic laws, and sudden violence, at least you had mastered one constant: the gentle inevitability of mortality. And now, as we let our minds drift past this first figure, consider the irony. The very people entrusted with enacting the ultimate consequence often spent their twilight years quietly negotiating small human concerns. A garden, a spouse, a cup of ale, a friendly nod from a cautiously respectful neighbor. Not a bad end, really, for someone whose life began with steel and shadow. Let's gently, almost imperceptibly move toward another sort of royal oddity in the next part. But for now, imagine the quiet garden of a retired executioner. The slow setting sun painting a warm glow across a life lived in grim but necessary service. Breathe, relax, and let the world's harsher judgments fade, at least for tonight.
So, let's drift over to the next royal curiosity. His name was Charles II of Spain. And yes, you can already feel the air of misfortune surrounding him. Because of course, he was nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Charming. Naturally, people suspected magic, curses, or some particularly vindictive family gossip. But the reality was much more mundane and much more tragic. Charles II was born in 1661 into the Habsburg dynasty. Now, the Habsburgs were famous for a number of things: power, ambition, dynastic marriages, and, importantly, a long tradition of inbreeding. And Charles, well, he was the perfect example of the consequences of taking inbreeding very seriously. He was the product of generations of marriages between close relatives, first cousins, uncle-niece, second cousins. The family tree looked more like a tightly knotted pretzel than anything resembling careful genetics. From birth, Charles was remarkably frail. He had difficulty feeding, walking, and later speaking. His body seemed perpetually awkward, almost as if it were quietly rebelling against the genetic insistence of his ancestors. His jaw was so pronouncedly misaligned that historians sometimes call it the Habsburg jaw. Imagine trying to chew cake politely in court when your jaw is threatening to detach entirely. Not ideal for a monarch. And his health, well, it wasn't great. He suffered from digestive issues, a weak immune system, and frequent fevers. People whispered about curses, natural divine displeasure, and even in some more creative accounts, an evil fairy godmother. The truth was more scientific, but far less entertaining. Generations of inbreeding had concentrated recessive genes that produced this frail, delicate body. Still, superstition sells better than biology, so the rumor mill had a busy life. Despite, or perhaps because of, his physical fragility, Charles was doted upon, spoiled, and treated with excessive caution. His caretakers wrapped him in blankets, guarded him against drafts, and carefully orchestrated every bite of food. And yet, This careful attention didn't prevent accidents, mild injuries, or embarrassing bodily functions that could not be ignored. Imagine a king whose greatest challenge at 6 was surviving the afternoon without tripping over his own feet. The psychological impact on Charles was profound. He grew up in a world where every glance could contain anxiety, every cough prompted panic, every sneeze was assessed for severity by a royal medical team that likely spent more time writing reports than actually treating him. And naturally, he internalized all this attention as something both oppressive and, strangely, validating. He was the king, yes, but also fragile, in need of constant observation, and never allowed to simply be a child. Education for Charles was similarly meticulous. Tutors ensured he could recite history, Latin phrases, and the occasional moral maxim. But physical activity was largely discouraged. He could not run, jump, or play with other children. Court games were modified to his abilities, which meant less fun and more awkward pacing. Naturally, he developed a reserved, slightly melancholy personality. Who wouldn't, after decades of careful supervision that treated the world as a hazardous minefield? Marriage, as with all Habsburgs, was political. Charles married his niece, another convenient family strategy designed to consolidate power and preserve dynastic continuity. The result, unsurprisingly, was further genetic strain. He and his wife produced no children. And this was, of course, disastrous for the Spanish monarchy. For a dynasty that prized succession above all else, having a king who could not father an heir was a subtle form of collective anxiety, magnified by court gossip, conspiracy theories, and endless speculations about curses. Charles's adult life continued in the same vein. He was incapable of physically enforcing authority, so he relied heavily on ministers, advisors, and a court that alternately admired and pitied him. His weak body contrasted starkly with the elaborate trappings of power surrounding him: gold, velvet, pomp, and ceremony. And all of it was, naturally, completely incapable of fixing the underlying reality. A king entirely at the mercy of fragile genetics and court politics.
One of the more ironic aspects of Charles's reign was that he outlived many of the people who tried to influence him. Ministers came and went, conspiracies flourished, and yet he endured. Perhaps the caution he had learned as a child, slow movements, careful planning, minimal exertion, turned out to be unexpectedly useful in navigating a court full of schemers and ambitious nobles. And yet, despite all the wealth, prestige, and ceremonial pageantry, there was a quiet sadness surrounding his life. Portraits of Charles often show a small, slightly hunched figure with a long, pronounced jaw and a distant expression. One imagines him sitting quietly, listening to the ceremonial noise of court, while internally thinking, "Why does everyone insist I smile for this?" Eventually, Charles II died in 1700, childless, leaving behind a kingdom anxious about succession and a dynasty teetering toward extinction. Historians have long debated whether the Habsburg line would have continued if not for such extreme inbreeding, but the evidence is pretty clear. Generations of carefully orchestrated marriages designed to preserve power ironically produced a king unable to sustain it biologically. And that, of course, is the quiet, almost tragic humor of Charles's life. Not in the sense of jokes or laughter, but in the gentle irony of human ambition colliding with biology. A king surrounded by wealth and opulence, meticulously groomed to rule, ultimately constrained by fragile flesh and misaligned jaws. It's a story that whispers rather than shouts. As we let Charles's story fade into the background, imagine him in that quiet palace room, sunlight spilling lazily across gold-trimmed furniture, a slight frown etched across his delicate features. Perhaps he's thinking about his childhood games, or the innumerable tutors who corrected him, or the awkwardness of court dances. And perhaps, just perhaps, he allows himself a small, private smile, knowing that in a world obsessed with appearances and power, he managed to endure. Now, with this figure gently tucked into the folds of history, we can drift toward the next royal oddity. There's more to explore in the world of fragile dynasties, odd habits, and petty miseries of those who were technically powerful, but in practical terms, rather helpless. But for now, let your mind linger on the quiet melancholy of Charles II, a king both bewitched and, ironically, enduring.
Let's drift over now to a queen whose story is equal parts melancholy and quietly absurd. Her name was Joanna of Castile, though history often calls her Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, a title that, of course, simplifies a rather complex life into a neat tragic label. Joanna was born in 1479, daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. Her childhood, much like the Habsburgs a century later, was a mixture of intense political grooming and emotional pressure. She was instructed in languages, etiquette, diplomacy, and the occasional hobby like embroidery or music. And yet, she was not permitted to make mistakes. Not ever. Because in royal households, imperfection was unacceptable, and even minor missteps could carry consequences far beyond the nursery. From a young age, Joanna was betrothed to Philip the Handsome, heir to the Habsburg territories in what is now Belgium. A political match, naturally. She had little choice, though a princess's agency in these matters was remarkably limited. And Philip? Well, Philip had his own set of charmingly opportunistic ambitions, which mostly involved consolidating his own power, ignoring his wife's feelings, and enjoying the privileges of a man born to command. Joanna's life with Philip was fraught with tension. She was intensely loyal and deeply passionate, which, in the context of Philip's aloofness, made her appear eccentric, or, as historians later claimed, mad. There are accounts of her following Philip from town to town, often refusing to eat, sleep, or bathe properly when he was displeased or absent. People in the court whispered. Observers commented. Chroniclers were fascinated. And Philip, naturally, was largely unconcerned, which only exacerbated her reputation. Now, whether Joanna was truly mad is a matter of debate. Many modern historians suggest she suffered from depression or some other mental health condition exacerbated by stress, isolation, and relentless political pressure. But the medieval and early modern courts were rarely sympathetic to nuance. A woman expressing grief, frustration, or anger in a context designed to suppress female autonomy was, by default, mad. And so the legend of Juana la Loca was born. Her daily life was equally peculiar. She was reportedly obsessed with Philip, keeping his letters, clothing, and personal effects close at all times. She would wander the castle, carrying objects that reminded her of him, sometimes speaking aloud as if he were present. Visitors and courtiers found this behavior unsettling, though not particularly threatening. Joanna was not malicious. She was, perhaps, the embodiment of extreme longing and enforced passivity. And then there was the infamous inheritance crisis. Joanna's mother, Isabella, and her father, Ferdinand, had carefully designed a succession plan to consolidate power in Spain. When Isabella died, Joanna inherited the throne, at least nominally. But Ferdinand, perhaps sensing her vulnerabilities or wishing to maintain control, effectively sidelined her. Joanna became queen on paper, while the real power was exercised by her father, and later by Philip. Philip's own ambitions complicated matters further. He sought to assert authority over Castile, often clashing with local nobles and administrators. Joanna, devoted and increasingly distressed, found herself trapped between loyalty to her husband and the expectations of her birthright. Her emotional responses, public displays of grief, periods of withdrawal, and insistence on following Philip wherever he traveled, were interpreted as madness, and so her personal sorrow became politicized.
By 1506, Philip died unexpectedly, leaving Joanna in a particularly difficult position. She reportedly refused to accept his death fully, keeping his coffin nearby for months, claiming he would awaken. Modern readers might cringe at the pathos, but in context, it was a sincere expression of grief, magnified by years of isolation, pressure, and enforced political invisibility. The court, understandably, found this inconvenient. Joanna's later life was spent largely confined to palaces, under the supervision of her father and later her son, Charles I of Spain. She was removed from the center of political power, ostensibly for her own good, though it conveniently solved the succession problem for the ruling family. She lived quietly, surrounded by attendants, occasionally wandering gardens, and reportedly conversing with memories of Philip. Her story is, in many ways, a quiet tragedy. She was intelligent, politically capable, and deeply devoted, yet her life was continually constrained by circumstances beyond her control. Her madness was at least partly a reflection of the limited roles available to women of her station, particularly when combined with emotional vulnerability and intense social scrutiny. And yet, there is something oddly tender about Joanna's life. Unlike many historical figures whose tragedies are performed in public, hers was intimate, almost private. She was a queen with immense symbolic importance, yet her personal desires were consistently subordinated to political necessity. One can almost imagine her, sitting quietly in a sunlit chamber, dust motes drifting lazily through the air, her mind wandering back to happier moments, or perhaps wondering why the world never allowed her small comforts. There is also the gentle irony of her legacy. She is remembered primarily for her supposed madness rather than her intelligence, strategic awareness, or loyalty. History distilled her life into a single dramatic word. And yet, in truth, Joanna's story is not about spectacle. It's about the quiet, constrained, slightly absurd reality of being both powerful and powerless at the same time. And as we let Joanna's story settle softly in our minds, we can drift toward another case of dynastic oddity, a figure whose fragility, bad decisions, or petty obsessions subtly shaped the course of history. For now, picture Joanna wandering the palace corridors, a soft sigh in the air, the sunlight catching the folds of her gown, the shadows moving gently across the walls. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just the slow, inevitable passage of time, measured in footsteps, sighs, and quiet devotion. Now let's drift over to France, to a palace so large that it practically required its own postal code, and a king so meticulously adorned that even his shoes were a political statement. His name was Louis XIV, or, as you might have heard whispered in slightly exhausted tones, the Sun King, a title that evokes warmth, radiance, and grandeur. And yet, for all the pomp, Louis was also extraordinarily petty, obsessively controlling, and occasionally prone to bizarre tantrums, because, of course, he was a king. And this is history. Louis was born in 1638, the eldest son of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. His early life was unremarkable in the sense that it was filled with ordinary royal annoyances, tutors, etiquette lessons, confined playtime, and an endless procession of advisors, ensuring that he was both thoroughly prepared to rule and perfectly constrained. Naturally, being raised to absolute power from the cradle requires a lot of supervision, and the young Louis was under constant scrutiny. By the time he became king, at the age of 5, the regency of his mother had him living in a gilded cage of ceremonial importance. All decisions were filtered through ministers, nobles, and diplomats, who patiently explained the intricacies of French governance while ensuring that the child monarch did not accidentally sign something inadvisable, like a declaration of war against his own allies. Louis's personal quirks, however, started to emerge early. He developed a fascination with appearances, clothing, posture, and lighting. Sunlight, of course, was particularly important. He demanded that his subjects bask in the glory of his presence, quite literally arranging court ceremonies around the hours of optimal sunshine. One imagines courtiers squinting, fanning themselves, and silently wishing for clouds. But nothing clouded Louis's meticulous vision of the world as a perfectly illuminated stage for his supremacy. As he grew, Louis's penchant for control extended into matters that were perhaps better left to chance. He personally supervised the construction and maintenance of Versailles, an enormous palace with elaborate fountains, gardens, and countless corridors designed to remind everyone exactly how central he was to the universe. Courtiers often got lost, servants suffered heat exhaustion, and landscapers quietly wondered why anyone needed that many statues of themselves. Yet Louis was delighted, naturally, as any self-respecting Sun King would be.
He was also extraordinarily petty in personal disputes. Nobles who slighted him in conversation were subtly humiliated at banquets. Mistakes in protocol, however minor, could result in weeks of public coldness or whispered gossip. One historian remarked that serving the Sun King was less about service and more about surviving a slow, steady test of humility and endurance. And, as history shows, most courtiers learned to tiptoe with extreme care. Louis's romantic life, too, was a parade of calculated convenience punctuated by emotional whims. He maintained multiple mistresses, some of whom were politically strategic, others less so. The court became a theater of subtle rivalries, quiet scandals, and the occasional noble dueling and frustrated attempts to regain dignity. And yet, Louis's own sense of proportion was peculiar. He oscillated between affection, neglect, and minor tyranny, leaving everyone involved slightly exhausted and mildly humiliated, which, of course, was entirely the point. Perhaps most ironically, despite all his grandiosity and meticulous control, Louis was still vulnerable to human frailties. He suffered from health problems in later life, including painful sores, gout, and declining mobility. Even the Sun King, with all his brilliance, could not avoid the slow attrition of age. And when one imagines the great halls of Versailles, once bustling with vibrant courtly intrigue, gradually quieting under the weight of illness, it's strangely comforting. Even a king of absolute power eventually has to navigate the gentle inevitability of human decline. Louis's legacy, of course, is immense. France became a Central European power, arts and culture flourished, and the Palace of Versailles remains a symbol of grandeur. Yet, if you look closely, you can see the subtler notes of personal foibles. The excessive control, the obsessive attention to detail, the pettiness in private quarrels, and the endless parade of human anxieties, magnified by the scale of monarchy. It's a reminder that even those who seem larger than life are, in truth, prone to the same petty frustrations, obsessive behaviors, and human vulnerabilities as anyone else. And so, as we let the Sun King recede gently into memory, picture Versailles at dusk. Fountains trickle quietly. Courtiers slink through long corridors, exhausted by ceremonial display. And Louis, the meticulous, petty, brilliant, and strangely human Sun King, slowly closes his eyes, perhaps contemplating which minor indignity he will correct tomorrow, or perhaps simply enjoying a rare moment of quiet, unobserved by anyone at all.
Now, let's drift over to France again. This time to a king whose life was marked by a peculiar and relentless fragility, not of body, but of mind. His name was Charles VI, sometimes called Charles the Beloved in his early reign, and later, rather tragically, Charles the Mad. A shift in reputation that, of course, the world was very eager to note. Charles was born in 1368, the fifth child of Charles V of France. His early years were largely typical for a medieval prince: tutors, prayers, carefully supervised play, and an endless stream of minor nobles instructing him in the art of governance before he could even write legibly. But as with many royal childhoods, his life was an incubator for both privilege and intense pressure. He ascended to the throne in 1380, at the age of 11, and naturally, being a child king in a kingdom at war with England required the kind of maturity one generally does not possess at that age. Regency councils, advisors, and distant relatives guided him, but the burden of kingship, even indirectly, often weighs on the mind and body in subtle ways. By his early 20s, Charles began to experience episodes of severe mental disturbance. He believed at times that he was made of glass, fragile and liable to shatter if handled too roughly. Imagine being a king who cannot shake hands properly for fear of breaking. Courtiers reportedly had to approach him with extreme caution, as though handling delicate crystal rather than a fully grown monarch. These delusions were accompanied by periods of extreme violence and paranoia. On occasion, he would attack his own advisors or flee the palace in terror. His periods of clarity were punctuated by bouts of confusion that could last days or weeks. This created enormous difficulty for governance. Laws were passed, revoked, and debated in a chaotic dance dictated by the whims of a king who could not always recognize reality. Charles's illness, now understood by modern historians as likely a severe form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder complicated by stress and potential head trauma, did not diminish his symbolic importance. He remained king because in medieval France, removing a monarch was not a trivial task. And so, France was governed alternately by regents, counselors, and factions jockeying for influence, while the king himself drifted in and out of perception. The personal cost, of course, was immense. He was isolated, surrounded by people who oscillated between devotion, fear, and opportunism. Friendships were precarious, alliances were fragile. He experienced life largely through the prism of his condition, which magnified the absurdities and dangers of court life. And yet there were moments of tenderness and clarity, times when he would engage in thoughtful conversation, display humor, or simply enjoy music and prayer without delusion.
Marriage and dynastic pressure continued as well. Charles married Isabel of Bavaria, a queen often maligned in chronicles, largely because the realities of governing a kingdom under a mentally ill king required her to act decisively. Their marriage produced children, though not without difficulty. Reports suggest both political manipulation and genuine maternal concern shaped Isabel's decisions regarding the upbringing of the royal heirs. And as is often the case with these chronically unfortunate monarchs, tragedy compounded upon tragedy. Charles's mental episodes coincided with periods of political turmoil, famine, and war. The famous Battle of Agincourt and the 100 Years' War unfolded in a world where the king himself sometimes could not reliably comprehend the state of affairs. And yet he persisted. The crown sat upon his head, not necessarily because he was competent at all times, but because monarchy, like inertia, resists simple removal. There is a subtle, almost poetic irony to Charles's story. He was a king of immense symbolic power,
expected to command armies, negotiate treaties, and inspire loyalty. Yet much of his life was defined by vulnerability, confusion, and the inability to control even the simplest of actions. He was both adored and feared, loved and pitied, at once the center of the kingdom and profoundly isolated from it. Imagine Charles wandering the corridors of the palace, muttering to himself, flinching at imagined threats, yet sometimes pausing to enjoy the quiet of a chapel or the warmth of sunlight spilling across the stone floors. His life was a slow, uneasy oscillation between perception and delusion, authority and helplessness. There is, in that oscillation, a strange dignity, a reminder that even in fragility, the human mind seeks continuity, order, and small pleasures wherever it can find them. And as we let Charles VI's story fade gently into memory, picture the quiet court around him. Courtiers tiptoeing, scribes recording events with extreme care, guards ever vigilant. The king himself, a figure both powerful and deeply vulnerable, moves like a shadow in his own palace. A life marked not by the glory of conquest, but by the quiet endurance of a fragile mind, navigating a world that demands decisiveness he cannot always provide.
Now, let's drift gently to southern Italy, to a kingdom bathed in sunlight, olive groves, and the occasional political intrigue. The figure we're observing is Ferdinand I of Naples. His reign, from the late 15th century, is marked by a curious combination of ambition, superstition, and relentless caution. Ferdinand was born in 1423, a prince in a world where courts were elaborate stages, and even minor missteps could prove fatal. As a child, he was taught languages, warfare, and diplomacy, as any noble heir should be. But Ferdinand's early experiences instilled a deep-seated fear of danger, betrayal, and sudden death. And, naturally, these fears never fully left him. By the time he ascended the throne, Ferdinand had developed a remarkable array of eccentric habits. He slept with the doors locked, consulted astrologers for every minor decision, and reportedly refused to sit on certain thrones because he believed they were cursed. One imagines courtiers quietly arranging alternate chairs while suppressing mild eye rolls. His reputation for superstition was so pronounced that it became a subtle form of governance. If the king feared something, it tended to become taboo in court, whether it made sense or not. Ferdinand's obsession with security extended to architecture. He reinforced palaces, built secret passages, and employed guards to patrol areas most people didn't even know existed. And yet, despite these precautions, political chaos continued. Assassinations, betrayals, and rebellions were a persistent reality, as they often are in medieval kingdoms. Ferdinand's eccentricity, rather than preventing danger, simply made it more structured. And then there was the matter of personal health. Ferdinand was frequently ill, which only reinforced his anxieties. He would avoid heavy food, travel cautiously, and generally insist on routines that minimized risk. In essence, he treated life as a careful game of chess against a universe that, from his perspective, was slightly hostile. His personal relationships were equally peculiar. Ferdinand married Isabella of Clermont, a woman of noble birth and presumably excellent patience. Reports suggest he treated her with respect, though often through the lens of suspicion. Was this meeting safe? Was this corridor cursed? The Queen's life, while outwardly comfortable, must have been a constant negotiation of minor anxieties.
Politically, Ferdinand could be both shrewd and oddly indecisive.
He navigated alliances, wars, and diplomacy with a careful hand, yet often overthought matters to the point of absurdity. Decisions were delayed, strategies revised multiple times, and advisors were consulted repeatedly, sometimes on the same question dozens of times. One imagines him pacing quietly in a sunlit study, consulting charts and astrologers, quietly muttering, "Perhaps if I move this army 3 feet to the left, or maybe not." There is a strange charm in Ferdinand's story, in part because it reveals the gentle absurdity of royal life when human neuroses are magnified by power. Here is a king entrusted with immense responsibility, who responded not with violence or grandeur, but with careful, deliberate eccentricity. His fears were amplified, his routines rigid, and yet somehow he maintained control of a kingdom. It's a testament to the peculiar ways human habits, even unusual ones, can coexist with power. And so, as we imagine Ferdinand in his quiet chambers, we picture the subtle rituals of daily life: guards pacing in near-silent formation, astrologers murmuring predictions, doors carefully unlocked and unlocked, corridors surveyed for imagined dangers. In this world of cautious magnificence, the king navigates a complex tapestry of anxiety, superstition, and routine with a remarkable, if slightly humorous, determination. Eventually, Ferdinand's reign ended peacefully, leaving Naples intact and largely stable, a minor miracle given the turbulence of the era. His eccentricities are remembered not with scorn, but with a kind of affectionate curiosity. He was a king who lived cautiously in a world that rarely allowed such safety, and perhaps that is its own quiet achievement. As we let Ferdinand's story fade softly, imagine the warm Neapolitan sun spilling over his palace, the scent of citrus in the gardens, and a king quietly moving along his meticulously inspected corridors, content that every precaution has been taken. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just the gentle, meticulous life of a monarch whose greatest battles were internal, and whose victories were measured in the subtle rhythms of a carefully ordered day.
Now, let's drift over to Scotland, to a queen whose life has been told and retold with a mixture of awe, pity, and mild exasperation. Her name was Mary Stuart, better known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots. A woman of immense intelligence, undeniable charm, and remarkably poor luck, because, of course, she was royalty. Mary was born in 1542. The only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland. She became queen when she was just 6 days old, which is objectively a rather abrupt introduction to the responsibilities of monarchy. Naturally, regents took over governance, but even in infancy, her life was marked by political intrigue. Nobles, clergy, and foreign powers all seemed to have opinions about her suitability to rule, none of which were especially helpful. Her early years were spent in France, largely as a political pawn in the elaborate chess game of European dynasties. She was educated carefully, learning languages, music, and courtly manners, but always with one eye on marriage prospects. At age 16, she married Francis II of France, a young king whose health and political skill were adequate, let's say. Tragically, he died after just over a year of marriage, leaving Mary widowed and unexpectedly returned to Scotland. Mary's return to Scotland marked the beginning of a life filled with drama, poor political choices, and constant threats to her safety. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was handsome, entitled, and, as events would show, rather unreliable. Their marriage quickly became a source of scandal. Darnley was prone to jealousy, temper tantrums, and general incompetence. And Mary, despite her political acumen, seemed to attract trouble wherever she went. Darnley's eventual murder, under circumstances still debated today, was a turning point. Mary's alleged involvement in the plot, combined with her romantic entanglements and precarious position as a Catholic queen in a Protestant country, made her life extraordinarily complicated. She was imprisoned, forced to abdicate, and ultimately fled to England, where her cousin, Elizabeth I, received her with polite suspicion and subtle coldness. In England, Mary's life took on the air of a slow, tragic comedy. She spent years under house arrest, moving between estates, constantly monitored and forever plotting, sometimes effectively, often not. She corresponded with allies, debated succession claims, and occasionally let her temper flare, which only reinforced her reputation as a dramatic, impetuous monarch.
One of the striking aspects of Mary's life is the contrast between her royal status and personal vulnerability. She was, theoretically, one of the most powerful women in Europe, yet she spent much of her adult life effectively powerless, dependent on the whims of her cousin, the English court, and the shifting tides of European politics. This combination of dignity, intelligence, and near-constant misfortune creates a quietly tragic portrait. Mary's story ends, of course, with her execution in 1587. She faced death with remarkable composure, though one imagines there was a quiet frustration at the absurdity of her situation. After decades of careful planning, intrigue, and survival, her life concluded not on a throne or in a palace, but at the execution block, a final twist of historical irony. And yet, there is something oddly comforting in Mary's story for our purposes tonight. Her life was full of tension, danger, and misfortune, but it was also rich with moments of wit, intelligence, and personal agency. She navigated impossible circumstances as best she could, and in doing so, left a legacy that fascinates centuries later. As we let Mary, Queen of Scots, recede into the quiet corridors of memory, imagine her in a dimly lit English estate, a book in hand, perhaps listening to music, planning her next move, quietly enduring the passage of time. A queen, powerful and yet constrained, tragic and yet dignified, navigating the world with the combination of intelligence, charm, and inexorable misfortune that history seems to favor. And with that, we can drift gently toward the next historical figure, a monarch whose combination of fragility, eccentricity, and odd habits subtly shaped the history of his kingdom, reminding us once again that royalty is rarely simple and rarely serene.
Now let's drift over to Spain, where dynastic ambition, inbreeding, and the occasional unfortunate marriage combine to create a very particular kind of royal misfortune. The figure we are observing is Maria Theresa of Spain, Queen Consort of France, and in many ways a woman caught between political necessity and personal hardship. Maria Theresa was born in 1638, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. She grew up in a palace filled with pomp, ceremony, and endless lessons in etiquette, diplomacy, and, for reasons that remain somewhat obscure, piety. Everything about her upbringing was designed to prepare her for one ultimate task: marriage. And not just any marriage, but a political union that would reinforce alliances between European powers. In 1660, she married Louis XIV of France, who, as we've already explored, was not exactly a man of subtle emotional depth. Their marriage was arranged, as most royal marriages were, to secure peace between Spain and France.
Maria Theresa, like many princesses of her era, had little choice in the matter and was expected to adjust quietly to the court of a man both brilliant and excessively controlling. The marriage itself was complicated. Louis XIV maintained his many mistresses with a sort of institutionalized efficiency, which Maria Theresa was expected to tolerate with grace. She fulfilled her ceremonial duties impeccably, bore several children, and generally carried herself with dignity. Yet, as her letters and contemporary accounts suggest, she was quietly melancholy, frustrated by the limitations imposed upon her, and often profoundly lonely. Her life illustrates the peculiar pressures faced by women in dynastic politics. She was the queen, yet her influence over actual governance was limited. She was expected to maintain appearances, produce heirs, and navigate the courtly labyrinth of etiquette, all while enduring the personal slights inherent in serving as a backdrop to a king's ambition. And she did so with a kind of quiet endurance that is remarkable, if somewhat underappreciated by history. There was also the matter of her health, which was fragile from childhood. She suffered from ailments that limited her mobility and required careful attention to diet and activity. Courtiers noted her delicacy with a mix of concern and irritation, as though her sensitivity somehow complicated the smooth operation of a massive, opulent court. And yet, she managed, navigating both her own limitations and the endless expectations of her husband, family, and nation. Her personal character, though understated, was notable. Maria Theresa was reputed kind, devout, and patient, qualities that were tested daily in the formal, highly scrutinized environment of Versailles. She cultivated quiet friendships among other women of the court, maintained correspondence with family in Spain, and attempted, when possible, to assert her influence in small, measured ways. But these efforts were often overshadowed by the brilliance, vanity, and sheer theatricality of Louis XIV. There is a subtle irony to her story. Maria Theresa, as queen consort, wielded symbolic authority, yet had little real power. She was the mother of future monarchs, yet her children often became pawns in the intricate game of European politics. She maintained dignity in the face of isolation, infidelity, and endless ceremonial duties, a quiet triumph, even if history has been less generous in acknowledging it. And so, as we let Maria Theresa's story fade into the background, imagine her in the quiet moments of court life, walking slowly through the gardens, reading letters from Spain, listening to music, or quietly tending to a small flower bed. She exists in the liminal space between visibility and privacy, performing her role with grace while internally navigating a life constrained by circumstance, health, and the peculiar demands of monarchy. Her story reminds us that royalty, despite wealth and ceremony, often comes with profound limitations. One can be powerful in title and utterly powerless in personal life. Maria Theresa's life was a delicate negotiation of duty, endurance, and subtle agency, a gentle, quiet kind of heroism, almost invisible to the grand narratives of history, but deeply human nonetheless. And with that, we can drift slowly toward the next royal oddity, a figure whose life combines eccentricity, misfortune, and the faintly ridiculous, reminding us that the human experience, even in gilded palaces, is often messy, fragile, and quietly ironic.
Now, let's drift down the Iberian Peninsula to Portugal, a kingdom of rugged coastlines, rolling hills, and occasionally unusually meticulous monarchs. The figure we are observing tonight is Peter II, a man whose life combined political ambition, eccentric caution, and a peculiar obsession with control. Peter II was born in 1648,
the second son of John IV of Portugal. As a younger son, he was not initially expected to inherit the throne, which allowed him a relatively less pressured childhood, though less pressured in a royal household is still an immense understatement. He received the usual lessons in languages, theology, etiquette, and diplomacy, along with an introduction to the ever-present anxiety that comes from knowing that your life is inseparably tied to the whims of succession and court politics. By 1668, circumstances changed. Peter's elder brother, Alfonso VI, was deemed incapable of ruling effectively due to mental instability, and so Peter was catapulted into a position of authority, though initially as regent rather than king, a role that required careful observation, patient negotiation, and the occasional gentle assertion of force. Naturally, Peter excelled at administration, but his tendency toward meticulousness sometimes bordered on obsession. Peter's reign is notable less for sweeping grandeur and more for the quiet, persistent micromanagement of his kingdom. He carefully oversaw taxation, trade, and infrastructure, often revising the smallest details multiple times. Courtiers and ministers learned that nothing escaped his scrutiny. A misaligned road, a misplaced toll, or even a poorly maintained garden could provoke lengthy discussions, minor reprimands, and sometimes absurdly detailed reports. One imagines a palace clerk spending weeks measuring the exact dimensions of gates and cobblestones, all under the king's watchful eye. And yet, for all his obsession with detail, Peter II was pragmatic. He understood the limits of his power and chose his battles carefully. While other monarchs of the era pursued extravagant wars or flamboyant building projects, Peter preferred stability, predictability, and the slow, steady consolidation of authority. His eccentricity was thus tempered by a practical sense of government, a combination that allowed him to maintain control without the dramatic upheavals that plagued many European kingdoms. Peter's personal life was equally cautious. He married twice, first to Maria Francisca of Savoy, whose death left him a widower, and later to Maria Sophia of Neuburg. His relationships were largely marked by formality, careful negotiation, and a subtle but persistent concern for appearances. He was not flamboyant, nor scandalous, nor particularly cruel, simply exceedingly attentive to details, which in a royal context is a form of quiet eccentricity. Health, as always, played a role. Peter reportedly suffered from minor ailments throughout his life, though nothing debilitating. Yet these afflictions, combined with his meticulous nature, led him to adopt routines that were highly controlled. He would rise, eat, and move through courtly life according to precise schedules, minimizing risk and maximizing efficiency. In essence, he treated life itself as a series of carefully measured steps, an approach that both stabilized and constrained him. Politically, Peter II navigated alliances, wars, and colonial ambitions with patience and prudence. His reign saw Portugal recover from earlier instability, strengthen its overseas possessions, and establish a degree of economic and administrative continuity that was remarkable for the period. And yet these accomplishments were achieved not through grandiosity or force, but through persistent, quiet attention to the minutiae of rule, a methodical, almost obsessive diligence that required both patience and endurance. There is an understated humor to Peter II's story. Unlike the flamboyant Louis XIV or the tragic Mary Stuart, he is remembered for no dramatic gestures or spectacular misfortune. Instead, he is quietly remarkable for the small, almost invisible eccentricities of his personality. A meticulous ruler, cautious in habit, obsessed with control, and yet effective. He demonstrates a type of subtle, enduring power that is often overlooked in history because it lacks spectacle. And so, as we imagine Peter II in his final years, we picture a palace marked by routine, order, and quiet efficiency. Courtiers move predictably along well-worn paths. Gardens are trimmed with geometric precision, and the king himself, ever watchful, reviews reports with a calm, measured eye. Nothing dramatic occurs. No public scandals unfold. Just the slow, deliberate passage of time, punctuated by minor adjustments, careful observations, and the quietly obsessive maintenance of a kingdom. Peter II died in 1606, leaving Portugal more stable and better organized than he had found it. His legacy is one of understated diligence, eccentric caution, and quiet control. A gentle reminder that not all monarchs need drama to be historically significant. Sometimes the most memorable rulers are those whose lives are quietly meticulous, observed only in the subtle rhythms of governance, habit, and enduring personal peculiarities. And as we let Peter II's story recede softly into memory, imagine the orderly halls of Lisbon's palace, sunlight catching the polished surfaces of meticulously maintained floors, the faint scent of trimmed hedges in the gardens, and a king moving slowly, deliberately, peacefully through his domain. A life marked not by spectacle, but the quiet persistence of attention, care, and gentle eccentricity.
Now, let's drift gently into the twilight of the Habsburg Empire. Tonight, we're settling beside someone whose life feels like a slow-motion tragedy, drenched in polite etiquette and heavy velvet curtains. His name was Rudolf, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the heir to one of the oldest, stiffest, and most politically exhausted dynasties in Europe. He was born in 1858 into a world that expected him to embody stability, dignity, and emotional discipline. Naturally, Rudolf was none of these things. He was sensitive, thoughtful, melancholic, and, on most days, quietly disillusioned by everything around him. In short, the perfect Habsburg heir, just not in the way the empire wanted. Rudolf grew up surrounded by tutors who all had the same general instruction: make sure he never feels anything too strongly. A rather difficult order, considering he was destined to rule a multinational empire constantly on the edge of political combustion. From a young age, Rudolf felt the pressure. He was expected to understand languages, military strategy, botany, etiquette, and the delicate art of appearing calm while desperately unhappy. His father, Emperor Franz Joseph, wasn't exactly a source of comfort. He was stern, rigid, and possessed a personality best described as emotionally beige. Rudolf, meanwhile, wanted to read liberal political writings and observe birds, a problem, naturally. He spent his adolescence drifting between palaces, hunting lodges, and the stiff atmosphere of Vienna's imperial court. Wherever he went, he carried with him a quiet restlessness, a sense that, if given the choice, he would have preferred to pursue anything other than ruling a fracturing empire held together by protocol, elaborate uniforms, and Habsburg stubbornness. Rudolf's personal life was equally constrained.
He married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, a woman who was not unpleasant, but was also, in the gentle narrative sense, not what Rudolf needed. Their marriage was formal, cold, and occasionally punctuated by small disagreements that neither of them had the energy to resolve. Rudolf sought emotional connection elsewhere, in friendships, occasional infatuations, and quiet escapes into nature. As he aged, Rudolf's melancholy deepened. He drifted into intellectual circles, read works his father disapproved of, and spoke openly, too openly, about his frustrations with the empire's conservatism. The court listened with polite horror. A liberal heir? One who wanted reforms? One who cared about the actual well-being of citizens? It was all terribly inconvenient. He developed a fascination with ideas of progress, transformation, and modernity. Unfortunately, these ideas were about as welcome at the Habsburg court as a small fire in a silk-draped ballroom. Franz Josef disapproved, ministers frowned, and even Rudolf's friends advised caution. Health concerns emerged as well. Rudolf suffered from anxiety, exhaustion, and bouts of despair. Doctors treated him with the standard medical wisdom of the time: tonics of questionable composition, brisk walks in the cold, and the occasional stern lecture about emotional fortitude. These interventions, unsurprisingly, achieved little. By his late 20s, Rudolf had become a quietly tragic figure. The empire's future rested on his shoulders, yet he felt increasingly unable to carry it. His relationship with his father deteriorated further. The emperor valued order above all. Rudolf valued a world that no longer felt possible within the walls of the Hofburg Palace. In this state of emotional exhaustion, Rudolf retreated more frequently to Meierling, a small hunting lodge that offered him the illusion of peace. Meierling became a place where he could breathe, think, and temporarily escape the oppressive spectacle of imperial life. It is here, of course, that Rudolf's story reaches its somber close, an event that would echo across Europe and contribute quietly, subtly, to the unraveling of the Habsburg dynasty. We will not dwell on the darkest details. They belong to history books, not to quiet nighttime monologues. What matters here is the atmosphere. A lonely heir, surrounded by obligations he never wanted, quietly overwhelmed by expectations he could not fulfill. And so we imagine Rudolf in his final weeks walking slowly through the winter forests near Meierling, snow beneath his boots, silence in the trees. A young man raised to rule an empire, wanting only the freedom to choose his own life. His story, tender and tragic, reminds us that royalty often compresses the human spirit into shapes it was never meant to take. As Rudolf's presence fades softly from tonight's memory, we let the snow settle quietly behind him. A lonely heir, a doomed dynasty, and the gentle truth that even those born into unimaginable opulence can feel profoundly, achingly human.
We're still floating through the quiet, faintly uncomfortable world of medieval executioners. And here, in this next soft corner of history, we arrive at something almost sweet. Almost. Because tonight, we're drifting into the lives of the executioners who, after decades of swinging swords, tying knots, and generally being the most avoided men in town,
tried to retire into something resembling normalcy. And, as you might expect, it rarely went the way they hoped. Let's settle in, loosen the shoulders, and drift toward yet another collection of oddly gentle misfortunes. Some executioners, believe it or not, tried to go into retail. It's always a touching attempt, like a cat politely trying to use a calculator. You can appreciate the effort, even when the outcome was written in the stars. One retired executioner from 16th century Germany set up a small herbal medicine shop. A charming idea. He specialized in poultices and tinctures for pain relief, because of course he did, and he marketed them as tested remedies, which technically they were. He had spent decades observing what worked on preventing infection in the condemned, often in the most hands-on way possible. But the public had some concerns. Not about the medicine, surprisingly. They were more troubled by the fact that the man selling chamomile ointment was the same man who had once executed their cousin's former landlord's nephew. Medieval people didn't always remember names, but they remembered who decapitated whom. And so the poor man's store remained politely avoided, sitting in the middle of town like a haunted spice rack. It's a shame, really. His remedies were apparently superb. Another executioner, also retired, tried running a tavern. This sounds promising. Strong drinks, dim lighting, cheerful crowds. But unfortunately, former state-sanctioned killer pouring your ale didn't quite encourage the warm social atmosphere taverns rely on. Patrons liked their beer served by someone who didn't have a record of dropping heavier things on people's necks. Still, some customers came. Mostly travelers, mostly the deeply confused. They would wander in, have a drink, exchange a few nervous glances with the landlord, and leave slightly faster than they arrived. He kept the tavern spotless, offered generous servings, and even reduced the price of stew on Fridays. Nothing helped. Local regulars would pass by the door, peering in, saying, "Oh yes, maybe tomorrow," and then continued to the friendlier alehouses 2 streets over. Eventually, the tavern closed, proving once again that medieval branding was a ruthless thing. There were also executioners who tried to marry into respectable families after retirement. This often went about as gracefully as you're imagining. Even if an executioner had wealth, and many did, marriage negotiations were like walking through a meadow full of rakes. One wrong step, and someone's father was shouting about tainted lineage or bad luck entering the household. Yet occasionally, someone would accept the match, usually a practical widow, often one with several children and a very efficient attitude towards survival. She would look at her suitor and think, does he have a steady income? Yes. Is he physically strong enough to carry sacks of grain? Yes. Will he, under any circumstances, be invited to dinner with my siblings? Absolutely not. Perfect. These marriages tended to be calm, quiet, and almost charmingly mundane. The former executioner would spend his days repairing tools, tending gardens, or crafting belts and leather goods, because many of them were skilled tanners. Their wives would handle the social side of life, which mostly consisted of gently explaining to curious neighbors, "He's retired, dear, he doesn't do that anymore," while subtly blocking their view through the doorway. Children of retired executioners often had a surprisingly stable life. A few even left the town entirely, moved to cities where no one recognized the family name, and built clean new identities. It was perhaps the closest thing to a fresh start the family could hope for. But for the parents, especially the father, there was always that faint trail of discomfort. Someone would eventually whisper about what he used to do, even if they got half the details wrong, and the old familiar distance would return. Retirement for most executioners was peace, but not anonymity. Some chose a different path. They became healers. It sounds ironic, but many had the skill set, deep knowledge of anatomy, herbs, and wound management. After all, executioners were often responsible for keeping prisoners alive until their sentence date. A dead prisoner was bureaucratically inconvenient, and medieval governments were not known for their love of paperwork.
So the executioner learned how to stop bleeding, recognize infection, splint bones, and diagnose illness. And town officials began quietly recommending him when reputable physicians were too expensive or too busy treating the nobility's chronic headaches. A retired executioner with healing skills occupied a strange social position. People respected the craft, but they also stared at his hands, wondering how many things those hands had, well, removed. Still, these men provided valuable care. They stitched wounds, treated burns, set dislocated shoulders, and sometimes served as unofficial midwives for difficult births. Their results were good, often better than the licensed physicians who relied mostly on astrology and guesswork. But once the crisis ended, the patient would thank him stiffly, back away slowly, and avoid eye contact for the next several months. Gratitude only stretched so far. Others sought solitude. A number of former executioners in the Holy Roman Empire became millers, quiet men who lived by rivers, listening to the turning of wooden wheels rather than the murmurs of crowds. Milling was respected, necessary, and solitary, the perfect combination. A miller didn't need to attend town gatherings. He didn't need to present himself at fairs. He didn't need to know every neighbor's name. He simply needed to keep grain moving through the stones and avoid flooding during spring. This suited the retired executioner perfectly. People would bring their sacks of grain, nod politely, hand over the toll, and leave. No questions, no staring, no whispered gossip. It was, in a way, the closest thing to normal life these men ever found. One chronicler noted that a retired executioner miller kept to himself so well that many newcomers did not know his former trade, which, for an executioner, was the sweetest possible sentence. And then, because history always has a few, some executioners tried to rebrand themselves entirely. One man in France attempted to become a traveling musician. He didn't choose a gentle instrument like a lute. No, he chose the drums, loud ones. He wandered between towns, performing in small squares for coins that people tossed with the enthusiasm of people giving money to a man they very much hoped would keep walking. He was apparently quite good. The rhythm was steady, the beat strong, the crowd presence surprisingly calming, despite the fact that half the audience was quietly praying he wouldn't introduce himself. Still, as hobbies go, it beat the alternatives. The truth beneath all these small, meandering stories is simple. Executioners wanted what everyone else wanted: a quiet life, a little respect, something to do with their hands that didn't involve rope or an axe. But society had a long memory, too long sometimes. Even when a retired executioner had served honorably for decades, even when he had done only what the law demanded, even when he had risked disease, revolt, and public fury, he was still marked. Marked as someone necessary, but not welcome. And so, retirement was less a golden sunset and more a gentle step sideways into the margins of the village, the quiet corners of trade, the places where people didn't look too closely. Let's drift onward, then, to what might be the most unexpected part of all, because some executioners didn't retire at all.
They passed the job down.
Let's ease into this next part together, settling a little deeper into the pillow, letting the breath fall soft and slow. Tonight, we drift into one of the most quietly fascinating quirks of medieval society: executioner dynasties. Yes, dynasties. Because some families looked at the job, this unpleasant, dangerous, socially radioactive profession, and said, yes, let's keep it in the family. Naturally, they made it complicated. Let's float into the dim glow of old workshops, the clink of steel being sharpened before dawn, the hushed whispers of children learning skills they probably didn't put on any form of medieval resume. And as always, we'll drift, gently, calmly, into the strange little corners of history. Executioners were often born, not made. In much of medieval Europe, the profession clung to bloodlines like a stubborn vine. Once a man became an executioner, even if he had been forced into the job as punishment, his children were considered tainted. That's the polite version. The less polite version is that they were considered socially radioactive. So when those children grew up, the list of respectable professions available to them was short. Very short. Possibly non-existent. If your father had been an executioner, you could try to join the clergy. The church would smile, nod, and gently suggest you come back never. You could try to marry into a merchant family, but they'd suddenly remember a pressing appointment somewhere else. And so many sons simply followed their father's profession because it was the one door not slammed shut. A strange inheritance. Not a manor, not a title, but a set of tools and a reputation no amount of scrubbing could remove. In some towns, the executioner's house was practically a miniature academy. Fathers trained sons from a young age, not in the dramatic Hollywood sense, no axe swinging in the yard, but in quiet, practical lessons. How to bind a prisoner's hands gently enough to avoid injury before the official moment. How to keep blades clean. How to prepare a site. And most importantly, how to manage people who never wanted to be anywhere near you. One observer described a young apprentice executioner as quiet, polite, and sorrowfully aware of his future. That was the vibe for many of them. Calm, resigned, a little tired even at age 13. Their fathers were often surprisingly affectionate teachers, soft-spoken men with a dry humor formed after decades of being ignored at social gatherings. And they instilled very practical life lessons. Keep your tools sharp. Don't stand too close to the crowd. Always check the rope twice. And remember, people will never greet you first. This was the medieval equivalent of a father giving you the talk about changing your horse's horseshoes or balancing the family ledger. Just significantly less cheerful. Sometimes the family business expanded beyond execution. Many dynastic executioner families ran tannery operations, making leather goods. Others doubled as unofficial surgeons. Some specialized in animal care. A few even acted as mediators in legal disputes. People reasoned that if anyone understood consequences, it was the executioner. This diversification served a simple purpose: offering their children more options within the narrow boundaries society allowed. A son might grow up tanning hides alongside his father, mastering stitches and cuts, not for the gallows, but for gloves and boots. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And interestingly, People were willing to buy leather from an executioner family if the price was lower.
The medieval poor were, after all, practical above all else. But even within the executioner dynasties, there were children who resisted. A few sons tried to flee the family trade. They would run away to another city, shave their hair, change their names, and apply for work as a carpenter or a guardsman. Some succeeded, but many were eventually recognized by accent, by face, or by someone who swore they'd seen that boy loading a wheelbarrow outside the gallows last spring. Medieval Europe was a large place on maps, and a very small place in reality. When these sons returned home, they usually faced the same resigned sigh from their fathers, and the same inevitable future. Not out of punishment, but because the world simply had no other place to slot them. It's one of the sadder truths of medieval life. Your role wasn't chosen, but inherited, like an old coat you never asked for and couldn't give away. There were also daughters in executioner families. They couldn't take up the axe, that was a male-designated job, but they often learned anatomy, herbs, and healing from their fathers. And many daughters became skilled midwives and wound tenders, quietly respected for their competence, even if no one wanted to stand next to them at festivals. Marriage prospects for executioners' daughters were limited, but they did exist. Daughters often married men from similar low-status groups: knackers, tanners, foreigners, traveling performers. People who also sat on the edge of society, where reputation mattered less than basic survival. And occasionally, a solid, practical man would say, "Yes, she's the executioner's daughter, but she keeps an orderly house and doesn't faint at the sight of blood," which, in the medieval world, was apparently a highly attractive combination. One of the most famous executioner dynasties was the Sanson family of France. Their lineage lasted nearly 2 centuries, covering multiple generations of executioners, including the man who oversaw the guillotine during the French Revolution. Their reputation was a strange mix of dread and professionalism. People didn't like them, but everyone agreed they were very efficient. The Sansons wrote letters, kept records, and even had surprisingly sophisticated views about justice. Some expressed regret about certain executions. Others believed firmly in the law. One described his role as a duty I inherited, not a choice I made, which might as well be the motto of every executioner family across the continent. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated. It was simply the path. And fathers handed that path to sons the same way blacksmiths handed down hammers or bakers handed down ovens. History is full of families carrying burdens quietly. Executioners carried theirs louder than most. Still, despite all the sadness woven into these dynasties, there were glimmers of something gentler. Executioner families were often tight-knit. They supported each other. They formed small, stubborn units of loyalty in a world that didn't offer them friendship. If the butcher refused to serve them, they shared what they hunted. If the church made them sit in the back pew, they sat together. If the town looked away, they looked toward one another. Their homes were often filled with ordinary moments: children squabbling over chores, wives grinding herbs for medicine, fathers mending harnesses or reading old legal documents by candlelight. Quiet lives, unremarkable moments, lived by people the rest of society insisted were other. But in their own homes, among their own kin, they were simply a family.
Let's drift forward now, slowly, softly, into the next part. Because some executioners didn't just inherit the job, they changed it.
Let's settle in again. Slow breaths, soft shoulders, lights low. Tonight, we drift into a quieter, more thoughtful corner of our story. One where medieval executioners stepped beyond their grim duties and tried, in their own quiet ways, to change how justice worked. And yes, it's unexpected, because the people tasked with ending lives were sometimes the only ones trying to make the system more humane. Let's drift into that irony together. For many executioners, the job wasn't about cruelty. It was about rules, rituals, and, oddly enough, fairness. They saw, up close, what the law did to people. They saw fear, regret, panic, and sometimes genuine innocence. A few executioners quietly admitted that they slept poorly after certain cases, not because of the act itself. They were hardened to that, but because something about the trial had felt off. And once you've seen enough trials that feel off, you begin to notice patterns. And so, surprisingly, some executioners became advocates for reform. The kind of advocates nobody invited to meetings, but who showed up anyway. One of the gentlest changes executioners pushed for was the removal of unnecessary torture. And yes, that says a lot about medieval Europe, that unnecessary torture was a category. Executioners were often forced to oversee interrogations, and many of them absolutely hated it. Torture was messy, unpredictable, legally complicated, and emotionally exhausting. And executioners, contrary to the medieval rumor mill, were not sadists. They were professional, efficient men who preferred tasks that had clear rules and predictable outcomes. Torture? The opposite of that. So some executioners began quietly advising judges, "My lord, we have enough evidence already. The prisoner will likely confess tomorrow without coercion. Perhaps it is not necessary this time." These gentle suggestions, coming from the very man who would be expected to apply the torture, often carried weight. Judges didn't always listen. Some adored paperwork and suffering, but many took the hint. And so, bit by bit, the worst procedures became rarer. Not because the nobles grew more merciful, but because the executioner was tired. Executioners also improved the methods of execution. It sounds grim, but their motivations were simple. Less suffering for the condemned, less chaos for the crowd, and fewer complaints from the city council. One German executioner kept meticulous notes on how many blows various swords required. His goal was to refine the tools until a single clean stroke was guaranteed. His notebook reads like a craftsman's manual. No cruelty, no excitement, just quiet precision. It was the medieval version of quality control. Unusual quality control, but quality control nonetheless. Over time, these improvements spread from town to town. Executioners would share tips during regional gatherings. Strange little conferences where men compared rope fibers the way artists might compare pigments. And so, a strange truth emerges. The people tasked with delivering death were often the ones working hardest to make it swift and dignified.
Some executioners even questioned the law itself. There are letters, rare, fragile things, written by executioners to city councils. They're polite, respectful, and quietly bold. One wrote, "I humbly ask that the council reconsider using the death penalty for theft, for the people do not favor it." Another, "The punishment is too heavy for the crime. Mercy would bring order more than severity." These men weren't philosophers. They weren't revolutionaries. They were simply practical observers who had seen the human cost too many times. No shock, then, that many city councils ignored these letters. Some probably used them as coasters. Others filed them under miscellaneous, next to documents about funding for new roofs.
But the letters existed, and in a way, they mark some of the earliest recorded attempts to moderate the justice system, not from nobles or scholars, but from the men society refused to touch. Even the way executioners prepared prisoners began to shift. Some offered quiet counsel, not spiritual advice, the clergy handled that, but a softer kind of mentorship. A man facing execution often needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't yell, condemn, or panic. And the executioner, oddly enough, was often the calmest man available. He had seen thousands of final hours. He knew the rhythms of fear and acceptance, so he spoke gently, told the prisoner what would happen, explained how to stand, how to breathe, how to keep their dignity. And prisoners, facing the end, often trusted him more than they trusted anyone else. There was no drama in these conversations, just soft voices, dim rooms, and the steady presence of someone who understood endings. Some executioners became quiet negotiators. They encouraged families to reconcile before the final moment. They carried letters between prisoners and relatives. They arranged for last meetings when guards refused. They made sure children weren't present during executions. They fought, gently but firmly, for small mercies that no one else thought to offer. These were not grand reforms, not sweeping changes, just moments of humanity from men who were never allowed to show humanity in public. But history is built on small moments, and these small moments mattered. Occasionally, an executioner's influence went further. In a few cities, executioners successfully argued for medical examination of prisoners before execution, a precursor to confirming whether a person was fit enough to be executed. The logic was practical. If a prisoner was gravely ill, execution could take longer, cause chaos, and create panic. But this practical argument had a hidden mercy. The very sick were sometimes spared execution simply because the city wanted to avoid a spectacle. In that quiet, accidental way, the executioner saved lives. Not many, not dramatically, but enough that old court records occasionally mention postponed due to infirmity, which was often bureaucratic shorthand for the executioner didn't want to deal with this today. Some executioners even acted as early forensic experts. When a suspicious death occurred, officials sometimes called the executioner, not because they trusted him socially, but because they trusted his knowledge of wounds. Executioners could distinguish between cuts made before death and after. They could determine the angle of a blow, the likely size of a weapon, or how long someone had lived after an injury.
This subtle, quiet expertise influenced legal outcomes. It helped identify murderers. It prevented wrongful convictions. It made certain trials more accurate. Subtly, quietly, with no praise and no acknowledgement, executioners nudged the justice system toward something resembling fairness. And then, as always, they returned to their homes at the edge of town, where no one would sit beside them at the tavern. It's strange how often history's most disliked figures performed small acts that softened the sharp edges of their world. They weren't heroes. They weren't martyrs. They weren't rebels. They were just people who had seen too much suffering and decided in their quiet way that enough was enough. Let's drift now, softly, into the next part. Because while some executioners tried to improve their world, others became strange, unexpected celebrities.
But the letters existed, and in a way, they mark some of the earliest recorded attempts to moderate the justice system, not from nobles or scholars, but from the men society refused to touch. Even the way executioners prepared prisoners began to shift. Some offered quiet counsel, not spiritual advice, the clergy handled that, but a softer kind of mentorship. A man facing execution often needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't yell, condemn, or panic. And the executioner, oddly enough, was often the calmest man available. He had seen thousands of final hours. He knew the rhythms of fear and acceptance. So he spoke gently, told the prisoner what would happen, explained how to stand, how to breathe, how to keep their dignity. And prisoners, facing the end, often trusted him more than they trusted anyone else. There was no drama in these conversations, just soft voices, dim rooms, and the steady presence of someone who understood endings. Some executioners became quiet negotiators. They encouraged families to reconcile before the final moment. They carried letters between prisoners and relatives. They arranged for last meetings when guards refused. They made sure children weren't present during executions. They fought, gently but firmly, for small mercies that no one else thought to offer. These were not grand reforms, not sweeping changes, just moments of humanity from men who were never allowed to show humanity in public. But history is built on small moments, and these small moments mattered. Occasionally, an executioner's influence went further. In a few cities, executioners successfully argued for medical examination of prisoners before execution, a precursor to confirming whether a person was fit enough to be executed. The logic was practical. If a prisoner was gravely ill, execution could take longer, cause chaos, and create panic. But this practical argument had a hidden mercy. The very sick were sometimes spared execution simply because the city wanted to avoid a spectacle. In that quiet, accidental way, the executioner saved lives. Not many, not dramatically, but enough that old court records occasionally mention postponed due to infirmity, which was often bureaucratic shorthand for the executioner didn't want to deal with this today. Some executioners even acted as early forensic experts. When a suspicious death occurred, officials sometimes called the executioner, not because they trusted him socially, but because they trusted his knowledge of wounds.
executioners could distinguish between cuts made before death and after. They could determine the angle of a blow, the likely size of a weapon, or how long someone had lived after an injury. This subtle, quiet expertise influenced legal outcomes. It helped identify murderers. It prevented wrongful convictions. It made certain trials more accurate. Subtly, quietly, with no praise and no acknowledgement, executioners nudged the justice system toward something resembling fairness. And then, as always, they returned to their homes at the edge of town, where no one would sit beside them at the tavern. It's strange how often history's most disliked figures performed small acts that softened the sharp edges of their world. They weren't heroes. They weren't martyrs. They weren't rebels. They were just people who had seen too much suffering and decided in their quiet way that enough was enough. Let's drift now, softly, into the next part, because while some executioners tried to improve their world, others became strange, unexpected celebrities. One traveling merchant described a famous executioner as the most educated man at the table, which made everyone else terribly uncomfortable. Naturally, because the medieval world had a simple rule. If the executioner seemed too refined, it raised unsettling questions. People wanted executioners to be competent, but not too competent. Respectable, but not too respectable. Cultured, but only if they stayed very quiet about it. That delicate balance created a very strange, celebrity-like aura, admired from afar, avoided up close. But some executioners gained recognition not for their skill, nor their style, nor their composure. They became famous for their writings. A few executioners kept journals, detailed, eerie, surprisingly philosophical journals. They recorded not only the names and crimes of the condemned, but also their own reflections on justice, society, and human frailty. Meister Franz Schmidt, for instance, kept meticulous notes on each case he handled. The tone is calm, almost meditative. No dramatics, no boasting, just a craftsman's quiet attention to detail. His journal became famous long after his death, admired by historians for its clarity and its humanity. People were startled to discover that the man society treated like a ghost had been deeply thoughtful. And in that sense, he became one of the most unusual celebrities of the medieval world. A public figure everyone despised and avoided, yet whose words endured more strongly than those of many nobles. Executioners could also gain recognition for not executing people. During chaotic political periods, the executioner sometimes helped broker deals. If a powerful prisoner offered information, money, or alliances, negotiations often passed discreetly through the executioner's hands. He became a symbol of ultimatum, part feared, part respected, part strangely necessary. And this position gave him a certain authority that even nobles acknowledged. There's a record of one occasion where an executioner convinced a high-ranking official to spare a rebel soldier, arguing that the boy did not act from malice. The official listened. The boy lived. People remembered the official's name for a few years. People remembered the executioner's act for decades. And sometimes celebrities were made through sheer superstition. In some regions, executioners were believed to possess magical healing powers because they worked close to death. People might avoid them on ordinary days, but if they had a child with warts, or a persistent fever, or a lingering curse, as people like to diagnose themselves, they might show up quietly at the executioner's door. And so, paradoxically, the executioner became a figure of both dread and hope, feared, avoided, but also trusted with the illnesses no one else wanted to handle. This created a kind of mystical aura, a reputation that traveled far beyond the city walls. And in a world before newspapers, magic was one of the quickest ways to become famous. But celebrity, for an executioner, had a very limited radius. Inside the city, people knew him, recognized him, respected his skill, however reluctantly. Outside the city, he was just another traveler, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he could buy bread without the baker's hands shaking. Many executioners treasured these small escapes, moments where anonymity wrapped around them like a rare luxury cloak. But they always returned, always stepped back into the role, always resumed the strange, lonely fame that came with it.